bringing you up to speed on the latest in conservation, science, and responsible hunting in Canada. Hey everyone, it's Mark Hall, and you're listening to the Round Canada podcast. So the last couple of years, I've been covering a story about the Elver Fishery in Atlantic Canada, mostly in Nova Scotia. If you remember from those episodes, elvers are the baby American eels that harvesters on the rivers are catching in the springtime just after they're born. They're translucent, so they call them glass eels on the marketplace. They capture them live. They're shipped sort of like aquarium fish over to Asia, where they're growing to large eels and used for food. So if you've ever had sushi with the little strip of smoked eel on the top of the sushi rice, that's most likely where it's come from, as an American eel that originated in North America. The US, I think down in Maine and places like that, also have Elver fisheries, the American eel. Now, the crazy thing about it is these little like glass, they're only like 3 inches long, are worth between $3,000 and $5,000 a kilogram. And so over the last couple of years, there's been a tremendous amount of chaos and violence on rivers in Nova Scotia and Atlantic Canada and places where they do have the Elver fisheries. So last year it got so bad, the Department of Fisheries and Oceans just shut the fishery down because fishermen go out at nighttime. There was just craziness between who was poaching, who the commercial licensed fishers were, who the indigenous rights fishers were. There were people that had weapons, guns on the river. And so Fisheries and Oceans Canada basically just said, that's it, shut the fishery down, pulled its officers out. And it was crazy. Like, it's crazy to think that something like this, a natural resource, is going to lead to like gunfire in the middle of the night on a riverbank, but that's literally how chaotic it was. Now, a federal judge just recently ruled that the fisheries, so there's this conflict between commercial license holders and indigenous people. And last year, fisheries, like after the season was closed, transferred 14% of the commercial fishers' quota to local First Nations. And that went to court. The federal court judge ruled that the federal government failed to properly consult the commercial fish holders on that. This year, when the season opened, again, chaos. There were one incident where there were like dozens of vehicles showed up at rivers in Nova Scotia where the commercial license holders were. Indigenous people showed up demanding that, they leave, that they took, like, that nets were taken from the commercial fishermen's, and law enforcement got involved. I saw pictures of, people in black balaclavas with their faces blanked out, like carrying guns, shotguns, sidearms, like literally open carry sidearms. There was one report that I read that the indigenous people that showed up told the commercial fishers that that felt they shouldn't be there, and that the entire total allowable catch should be transferred from the commercial fishers to the First Nations that were there. So it's just it's a super charged, chaotic environment of, like almost like cartel drug kind of stuff, right? Because these things are worth so much money.
Yes.
And we see that in the illicit wildlife trade too, like, things that are worth so much money. Like, I mean, literally, like rangers in Africa are being shot.
Mm-hmm.
They're carrying machine guns and whatnot, and confronting poachers with ivory and whatnot, and like people get killed, and then sort of organized, efforts to go seek rangers out and murder them because they've been, on tracking poachers and stuff. Like, feels like it's in that kind of world, and it's here in Canada.
Yeah, that is wild. It's like mafia type stuff, but when you get big money like that, that opportunity for people to make money like that, then people just don't think clearly. Resources are, you know, not really considered. It's all about the money and who can make the most of it.
Well, that's definitely a driving factor behind. Like, I don't know how much you could catch in an evening. Like, I mean, if it's $3,000 to $5,000 a kilogram, like, would like one net scoop get you like a
Mm,
kilogram of fish? Like, I don't know. Like, could people literally make hundreds of thousands of dollars a night?
right.
That I don't really know. Like how efficient it is to catch these things and make a lot of money, but they are like they're not an endangered species in Canada, but like they're threatened or they have like a conservation concern on them. So when we're talking about sort of uncontrolled um, fishing. So the commercial licensed fishers have a quota, which DFO figures out based on kind of like salmon, like a run. You predict, you get so many kilograms, your quota or whatever, and then the rights holders are allowed to fish, but they're not regulated by quota. They look after themselves. And then you have poachers that are just in there, at nighttime, trying to
Swipe
just
some.
catch fish and then
Yeah.
sell it to buyers, or whatever, which would be like completely unknown what kind of an impact they would be having on the resource. So yeah, it's a crazy situation. Because of the money that's involved, it almost just sounds like they just need to shut the whole thing like down and over the winter time and get people together and get it sorted, like not to open the fisheries with these types of unresolved issues because somebody is going to get killed or hurt.
Hmm.
There's just no ifs, ands, or buts that it's headed that way. When people are packing guns, it's somebody's going to get carried away and use one. So yeah,
Yeah.
it's unfortunate to enable the situation when those tensions are there, and to like, okay, everybody will be okay, the season opens tomorrow, like it's not going to be okay.
Hmm.
So but if you shut it down, then the commercial fishermen are like, hey, look, like we have licenses that you've issued us, you're keeping us from making a living because you can't like look after enforcement, like DFO.
Hmm.
And the rights harvesters would be like, doesn't matter what you say, if you shut it down or not, we're allowed to go fish and there's nothing you can do about it. So it's a it, it's kind of a lose-lose situation. Like I think,
Yeah.
the rights harvesters should feel comfortable to go out and catch and make a living. It's part of what's called the moderate livelihood. Like they're entitled to actually catch stuff and make, a moderate livelihood from
Hmm.
doing this. It's not just a personal use thing. So that's their right. So how can we accommodate that and also allow some commercial fishermen to make a living off of it and everybody gets
Be
along?
safe.
Like
Yeah.
and I don't know enough like about the actual, like you'd think, well, can't people just say like you're on that part of the river and we're on this part of the river? It could be one of those things where it's like you got 100 kilometer stretch of river, but it's like it's this 1 kilometer section and it's like that's where they all are. Just like salmon, they run,
Mm.
but they're in like pulses. They're not evenly distributed along the entire length of there's a big run comes up. They hold in pools. They move at nighttime. So when you're in tune with that, like you're not going to be like, well, why do I have to go down there because that's not where the eels are stacked up or or something like that. So yeah, I don't know enough about how they are that way to set up some kind of alternating opening dates or different rivers or whatever. I just don't know what's going on behind the scenes to actually try to alleviate the situation of rights holders. Like, I mean, two sets of rights: the
Hmm.
rights of a license holder versus the rights, constitutional right, fishermen. So,
Sounds hectic, though.
oh, and there's another story that was kind of similar thing happening. I think it's happening again with the lobster fishery off the east coast in the Micmac, or Mi'kmaq, their moderate livelihood fishery and the commercial fisher. And so there's been conflict around that as well to, where people, lives were at risk. So it's, wow, it's crazy stuff. I hate seeing that
Yeah.
happen here in Canada or anywhere in the world, really. Got to find a better path forward.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of along the same lines of harvesting rights in Saskatchewan in 2014, 3 Métis men were charged with hunting without a license. I don't know if they're hunting and fishing or just hunting. So that was 2014, 10 years ago. In 2018, they were charged guilty of hunting without a fishing license. And so on April 14th, there was the appeal trial for those gentlemen started up again in the Saskatchewan courts. So in 2022, the Saskatchewan Court of Appeals granted an appeal of the 3 men that were convicted in 2018. So this year, on April 14th, that appeal trial is coming before a judge. I can't believe the time frames in these things, like over a 10-year period. Like, holy smokes, that says a lot about about the state of our judicial system.
No kidding. Well. Yeah.
So the reason the appeal was granted was the Court of Appeal said the men could pursue their constitutional rights if they could prove their affiliation with the historic Métis Nation. And that's a little bit different than First Nations. Like, to claim Métis status, you have to be able to demonstrate your ancestry back to one of the established Métis nations. So
I've tried to do that. It's hard.
Is it?
Well, yeah. I thought, well, maybe I should try and get my Métis status, but because I don't have great relationship with my Métis grandpa right now, and then I need his information about his parents. Gotcha. I need their names, I need their birthdays and where they were born. So I need information from him, and he'd never wanted his Métis status himself. For his own personal reasons. He didn't want any government help. No government money, which is fair enough. But I thought, well, maybe I should try and get it. But without his information, which I just don't have, then I can't. I'm kind of on a roadblock. So,
wow.
Yeah, you just, I figured, well, now I'm stuck. So I guess I won't be getting my Métis status.
Well, yeah, I mean, that just goes to show you kind of how complex it could be. And imagine if people's family members had passed away. I mean, then... Right.
Yeah, and then it needs to be like within...
lost, paperwork gets, thrown out, that sort of thing. And I'm sure that's a very common story for a lot of Métis people in Canada, is just the inability to prove their affiliation with one of the nations or the communities. So
yeah,
the difference in Saskatchewan is, and it's like this throughout the prairie provinces, is First Nations have the right to hunt anywhere in Saskatchewan under Section 35 of the Constitution. Métis harvesters have specific zones in Saskatchewan they're allowed to exercise Métis harvesting, but this court case is about Métis hunters challenging that, saying that they should have, or they do have, the same constitutional rights as First Nations and essentially could hunt anywhere. And so, of course, hunting without a license outside a Métis harvesting zone is the way to get this in front of a judge to make that landmark ruling, which would then apply to people all over Canada. So I have not seen a story of that trial, because it's like the end of April now. It's been 2 weeks, given that this whole thing started in 2014. I imagine that the appeal court case is probably not over in 2 weeks. So It could be two more years, who knows? But that's kind of what's going on in Saskatchewan, is basically a challenge to Métis harvester rights, looking for the same status and rights as constitutional First Nations hunters. So
yeah, I get it, but
another challenging story. Just every year these types of conflicts just continue to happen across the country, and it just seems like there's very little resolution to a lot of these rights harvester type issues, and it's so unfortunate. I think this is stressful for everybody,
Mhm.
and I just wish there was a a better path to fixing some of these problems. Court's expensive, people getting mad at each other, conflict in the outdoors. It's just I don't know what the answer is, but I think the current approach is being led, by governments across this country is not the best way to do it. So,
Especially when it just drags on and on without any clear resolution or path forward, or I don't know how to find the answer to this one, but it just seems like they're just kicking it down the road as much as possible so they don't have to deal with it, or maybe somebody else will deal with it at some point, because it is so complex and challenging.
and if you're the one fighting for your what you believe are your rights, then essentially that's the playing field. You've got to get a Supreme Court judge to make a decision on a case, which becomes case law and a precedent in the country, and they
Yeah.
just continue to challenge it every place that they can, and trying to get in front of a judge and get a landmark ruling. And I mean, a lot of Indigenous peoples, First Nations peoples' rights were established in treaties and constitutions, but they actually had to do the same thing. They had to go through this, right to a Supreme Court decision to say this is
Mm.
what the treaty actually means, or this is a right that is conferred under the Constitution. It's kind of like everything that they have now is been fought and won through decades of court cases and appeals. And yeah, that's
Yep.
just a costly way to treat people, like really, costly, not just in a social context, not necessarily a monetary
Mm.
context. So,
Mhm.
but we'll keep covering the stories, and
See where that
it's
goes.
about awareness. It's about awareness that there's still just a tremendous amount of hot spots in this nation where there's rights harvesters are still in conflict with our governments. Yukon hunting
Mhm.
regulation changes.
Yes, there's been a lot of changes in those regulations, especially around youth. So I've got all these notes here. So deer permits have changed. They're now 20 plus 2 additional for youth hunters aged 14 or 15. And now 16 adult permits, not 10, are split between these two different areas. So I guess the deer population is increasing. They need to, they're now able to apply more pressure in those areas because there's an abundance there. There's moose permits are now 15, up from 7 in the Fish Lake and Mount Lauren Moose Management Area. Each get 4 new permits. There's the Braeburn elk is closed for the 25-26 season to support population recovery. So the elk not doing so well in that area. Bison as well, they have been reduced. That ends on March 24th to reduce pressure on pregnant bison.
Makes sense. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, those elk herds, we did a podcast a couple of years ago on sort of contrasting the Yukon elk and Ontario's elk, because there's similar things where there's not a lot of them, but different scenarios. And the Yukon ones are a lot about agriculture conflict, because there's just like a couple of areas where the elk live and they're agriculture producing zones, but their population is like, not the greatest, but they do wreak havoc on agriculture producers, especially on stored hay in the wintertime. So it's this balance between trying to hunt them, but also have like a sustainable population in the valley. It's a super complicated scenario for elk management in the Yukon. But so Yeah, this and bison are kind of the same way in the Yukon, from what I understand. Like they're kind of like they're okay, but they're just making a living. They're not super
They're not,
booming.
yeah. And then
Same with northern.
if the deer populations are booming, then their habitat is all kind of the same, right? And their what they eat and everything. So if there's a ton of deer, taking up room, it's kind of pushing everybody else to the side, or
Well, especially mule deer because they're browsers, so that
mhm.
could run some issues with moose and bison, which and elk, which are all going to need to browse during the wintertime. Now, the mule deer tags, so they were increasing tags in some of the zones, but then splitting them so that some were youth specific.
Yeah, they get some of the youth get
Okay,
additional
additional tags.
if you're
Okay.
14 or 15.
Well, I
Yeah,
mean that's cool because
yeah,
it forces adults to take their kids out hunting as opposed to leaving them at home when the big game season opens, and because that has happened. I know that's happened where I live and stuff. And I remember one of the wildlife biologists said, I'm going to start the youth deer season on the 1st of September. All the bow hunters went, hey, we have 9 days to hunt elk in an archery season. And now the kids are going to be out there with rifles,
mm,
disturbing everything. And the biologist said, you know what, you guys, stop thinking about yourselves. You're really good at hunting for yourselves, but you're also really good at leaving your family at home. So I want to create a youth season so that you get your kids out there and get them into this activity, and they have their own 10-day season where they're not competing with the adult hunters. So I never forget that conversation where the biologist was just giving this room full of guys shit for not taking their kids out and then complaining that the kids got their own season. So
right. Kids are getting
no,
out
it's
there, getting off the Xbox, and they're getting
no,
after it.
totally. What a great thing to do. So any
Yeah,
other changes happening in the Yukon
yeah. The
regulations?
grizzly bear
Mm,
in the Haines Road corridor on 100 meters on either side of that corridor is prohibited, and it's to address the concerns from the local First Nations communities there. Um, so
of
that,
bears is being shot from the road.
yeah,
Yeah,
too
okay.
close there. And then the Kluane, am I saying that right?
Kluani?
Kluane Wildlife Sanctuary permits not available due to Dall sheep conservation concerns. So that's another one. There's new regulations for Little Atlin Lake, seasonal harvest closure on lake trout. So this is moving over to fish net there now between July 1 and to November 30th. So that's a big closure on lake trout to protect the numbers. Um, the trout have to
Wow.
be 585 to 650 millimeters in length, and you can only use a single point barbless hook to reduce harm. Yukon Game and Fish, they're excited about the increased youth permits for the deer. They're happy about the moose, but could be higher due to low harvest success. So um, I guess there's more moose there, but it's a challenging species to be successful at.
Yeah, so that's a typical balance that game managers have to make. Like if they're like, we got 100 moose and we
Mm-hmm.
can sustainably take 10, but they're really difficult to hunt in that particular management zone, and 1 in 10 hunters gets a moose, 9 don't,
Yeah,
then they got to, and this doesn't look good to people that don't understand it, but they issue more permits
mm-hmm.
in order to get just 10 moose. So sometimes it's like they could literally issue like 100 permits because they want to harvest 10 moose,
Yeah,
but the success is really low. If they only issue 10, they get one moose taken, where the managers are like, well, that's way under harvesting. So, but to somebody looking in from the outside, go, the moose population isn't doing very good, and they let out 100 permits.
right.
So it's it it doesn't look good, but you got to bring in that whole factor of hunter success. And then
Mm-hmm.
I've heard people say like, well, what happened that year if everybody just happens to be lucky and your success shoots way up? And that does happen, usually not to like 100% success, but it could
Mm-hmm.
go, say, from 10% success to 15% success. And instead of harvesting 10 moose, you accidentally harvest 12 or 15, then it just gets cut out, reduced further the next year. Then they say, oh,
Yeah.
that we drop our harvest to 8 or 6 or something like that. So
Yeah, you
it's
just adjust.
it's a complicated numbers game. So you kind of wonder if it really pays off sometimes. So
Hmm. Um, the other story out of the Yukon was the dam, the Whitehorse hydroelectric dam. So there's this dam that was built in 1958, and now the license has come up again for renewal. And it's a bit of a touchy subject because the dam actually kills a lot of the salmon that come up through that river to spawn. The turbines get them when they're young, when they're smolts, and so
yeah, that's
initially,
where they're trying to get back down the river. They get
yeah,
sucked through the dams. Yeah. Okay. Okay.
yeah. So initially, the Yukon Energy wanted this license renewal, and then things were going to happen, but then the brakes were pumped because conservationists were saying, and First Nations communities were saying, well, hang on a second, the due process isn't being thoroughly thought out here because you're just giving the green light on this license, but what about the salmon? What about the environmental impact? So initially, Yukon Energy wanted a 25-year license. They ended up getting a 20-year license. I believe. I was trying to wrap my head around this story. There's like so many. I feel like there's a lot of different factors to this. It's not like a thumbs up, thumbs down kind of scenario here. There's different factors involved with the salmon and with the First Nations communities. If there's more than one First Nations community impacted, and then there's the non-First Nations community, the people who need the power. So at the end of the day, it looks like it's going to happen. That the license will be renewed.
Operating the dam. Okay.
Yeah, but as long as these mitigations are going to go forward, and Yukon Energy has to make sure that the salmon are going to be protected and not get chopped up into little pieces from these turbines. And then there's
so there must be fish ladders. So when the salmon run, they must be able to get around the dam.
Yeah.
Spawn, and then the concern is the fry or the smolts coming out are getting caught in the turbines if there isn't some kind of a barrier for them.
Yeah, exactly. Those fish ladders need to make sure that they're going to protect the fish from these turbines.
Yeah, and I think fish ladders are only headed upstream. I'm not super familiar with what they do to prevent, like to capture fish to move them downstream, other than just literally have fish nets and then manually move the fish around the dam. I'm not sure what's going there, but it just sounds like that's a mortality
huge
of salmon.
Yeah, it's a big. CBC News said a third of the smolts get killed from these turbines. So that's a big issue to address as far as the success rate of the population there, because that's already it's a declining population. It's a sensitive population, and it's an important one for everybody involved up there. But this dam, it provides a lot of power to the communities up there. So power needs to happen, and so everybody's trying to figure out how to make everybody happy in this situation. And Yukon Energy, of course, wants this contract, wants it to go forward. So it sounds like they're making the necessary changes to make sure that the salmon are happy, the First Nations communities are happy, and they can continue to operate. But there's also talks about other forms of power in the future, because there's the carbon footprint issue as well with using this type of power with the water license, the water power, to power the dam. So there's that whole issue as well with carbon. Carbon is, what we're all getting taxed on, and the government has lots of plans for carbon as well. So that's another issue.
Hydroelectric power next to nuclear is kind of like one of the the least carbon generating, because it's not burning anything, right? It's just literally like motion that creates energy and delivers power, but it has a lot of consequences in blocking rivers and creating reservoirs behind them with for fish and wildlife, like valleys that get flooded and stuff behind dams. So yeah, it's super. And as soon as you start talking nuclear, then as a power generating, then everybody thinks like Chernobyl, kind of thing. So it's
everybody sees mushroom clouds in our mind's eye.
It's a tough one. So it'll be interesting if that story pops up again to kind of get an idea of what happens. And I mean, it sounds like they're monitoring fish passage, going up and going back, so that they must have some kind of a spillway or a chute that the baby salmon get into and go down like a big water slide sort of thing around. But then if they're below the water, then they're just going to get pulled in by where the water intake goes into the power generating turbines. So that's
another issue. There was the hatchery program, because apparently there was too many hatchery fish, not enough. I guess a hatchery is sort of supporting the population, but that's not the ideal situation, right? You don't want too many hatchery fish. You want the wild salmon to be, those numbers to be healthy and robust, and not be relying on hatchery fish all the time to prop up those numbers. So that is the goal, to reduce numbers of hatchery fish and make sure that wild salmon population is healthy and strong, and everybody still has power. That's that is the goal.
Yeah. That's one of those super tough ones. When they built the Peace Dam in northern BC, it was kind of the same way. It power generation, but it was such a large dam that it cut off the migratory run for a population of bull trout. And they were supposed to have built bypasses for bull trout, but the fish scientists during the environmental assessment stage were saying bull trout do not like to use fish passages. They're a fish species that are just don't like the structures. And so essentially the dam was going to completely halt and probably bring to termination an entire bull trout population. So that's tough thing to do when you're a country that relies so much on hydropower. Quebec, Ontario, BC all rely a lot on it, and obviously in the Yukon as well. So cool. Well, thanks for covering the Yukon stories. We'll jump down to Vancouver Island. This was a story a few years ago, 2 years ago in November. A fella shot and killed a black bear and its cub in Tofino, shot him with archery equipment. He was supposedly seen by some tourists in the Tofino area, reported, charged with killing these two bears, several different charges, killing a cub less than 2 years old, killing a female in the accompanying of cubs that were less than 2 years old, like a number of different charges, and then a bunch of weapons charges. Apparently, if I remember right, the guy had like all kinds of stuff in his home or whatever, different types of prohibited weapons and whatnot. So this fellow was convicted to 30 days in jail and an $11,000 fine, of which the lion's share of that fine was going to go to the Habitat Conservation Trust Foundation to reinvest back in conservation projects. The fella appealed that decision, and it was recently upheld by a appeal court judge in British Columbia, kept the conviction and the sentence. So person's got 30 days in jail and $11,000 fine, has stuck for killing these 2 bears back in November of 2023. So unfortunate situation. And I think also, if I remember, he was prohibited from hunting or possessing weapons for 20 years.
Wow.
So, and weapons means archery equipment,
Hmm.
firearms, anything that could be constitute a weapon for killing wildlife. So good news, bad
Well,
news story, kind of. Bad news
yeah.
when it happened. Good
Yeah.
news that the sentence was upheld. So,
Hmm.
story out of Toronto. So, people have probably heard about the whole thing with light pollution. You know, you get in cities, you can't see the stars and whatnot, and that's been identified by scientists for a long time as being an issue in big major metropolis areas for migrating birds in the springtime that are relying on nighttime stars and whatnot for migration. And so the city of Toronto is apparently the first city in North America to adopt a migratory bird protection policy where they're asking businesses and people and everything in the spring of the year to turn their lights off. So
Hmm.
business towers that would normally leave them on, they're sort of asking the city to, as much as possible, black out as much as possible to help out the migratory birds that are passing through the greater Toronto area. So it's kind of a cool story. I
Yeah.
don't know if anybody's monitoring this. So it's great to say it,
Yeah.
but at the end of the day, before and after, lights were all on, killing X number of birds, lights were all off, percent reduction in birds being running into buildings and whatnot. I don't know. And I didn't see anything in the stories I read that there was that type of thing attached to it. But anything in conservation, I believe, if you're going to do something and you're not measuring your outcome, it's almost as good as doing nothing. Like you
Yeah.
need to know. You need to know if it's working, because if it's not, then you need to adjust and do something else. So, like, put a giant black tarp over Toronto or something like that might be
Yeah.
the solution. Like the ones they pull over the ball fields when it starts raining.
That's right.
But the part about this story that I kind of thought was interesting is I think Toronto is the closest city we have in Canada that emulates some of the big cities in the United States. Like Vancouver, Calgary, and Edmonton don't even come close in my experience.
Hmm.
Toronto, it's like it's a Detroit, it's a Fort Worth, it's a like it's a big scary place. Like, just get me out of here.
Yeah. I've never
But
been.
to be the first city in North America to adopt migratory bird protection policy, I kind of thought was cool, and so it's a shout out to Toronto for trying.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Hopefully, you're counting birds, and we're seeing some good numbers. The last story I got on the list, I think everybody's heard about this over the last month, is scientists have resurrected the dire wolf
Oh
that
yeah.
went extinct thousands and thousands of years ago. I think folks have probably seen enough information on it to know that the dire wolf was not resurrected. The offspring are not true dire wolves. So what I found out is they're gray wolves
Okay.
that they did gene editing in, and here this is pretty cool. So the gray wolf genome is 2.5 billion bases long. They edited 20 genes out of 2.5 billion and inserted or replaced 14 genes from the dire wolf. So 14 edited into 20 different locations out of 2.5 billion. And the headlines were de-extinction, the dire wolf brought back from extinction. So the analogy I heard from an opponent of that narrative is chimps' DNA and ours, we share 98.8% of the same genetics. So if you edited 20 genes in a chimpanzee and inserted 14 human genes, does that make the chimpanzee a human?
No.
So I was like, that's kind of cool. So Scientific American, the publication, kind of did an interesting story, which I think was a lot more relevant, and they were trying to shift the conversation from resurrecting extinct animals via DNA to the technology of cloning existing animals that are on the brink of extinction as the tool to halt extinction. And the one that come up with is the red wolf. If I remember right, they've done some cloning in trying to replicate the number of individuals, because quite a few of them are dying every year in the southern United States. So there's pros and cons to the whole conversation around resurrecting. I think everybody's seen the whole thing where they want to resurrect the mammoth, and
Yeah.
but all they're going to do is the same thing. They have bits and pieces of DNA from like preserved mammoths that they would insert into its closest living relative, which is the Indian elephant.
Okay.
And so whatever genes that they happen to have, whatever they code for, would most likely be expressed in the Indian elephant, but it doesn't make it a mammoth.
Right.
From what I understood, one of the characteristics of the dire wolf that was expressed in the gray wolf was the larger jaw. So the dire wolves were very well known for having this oversized lower jaw and massive crushing power. And so apparently these gray wolves have, like, that's one of the places that the gene expressed itself was a little thicker jaw. So, the best you might get is a slightly more hairy Indian elephant, something like that. So, or blue eyes or, or whatever, but people are going to be like, it's still an Indian elephant.
Yeah.
And, it's caused a lot of debate about the ethics. Of course, wolves, everybody's all up in arms about, moving wolves around and translocating wolves and, and whatnot, because, they're killing cows and have an impact on people's livelihood and game and stuff. And so now these dire wolves, which were like massive animals, like people are envisioning these things reestablished on the landscape. So they're like, no, this is ethically not the right thing to do. A mammoth went extinct 10,000 years ago because of certain things. It shouldn't be back on the landscape now. I guess the only flip side to that conversation that I sort of thought of is they're experimenting with a technology in doing this that possibly one day the last known species of an animal might literally be in a scientist's hands. The body is still limp, and it's like, that's it, extinction. And from that moment, do something to potentially restore a much fuller replica of that species. So I'm almost like, if they play around with it, maybe that's what it might do one day with a black-footed ferret, or something like that. But then the scientists in Scientific American were saying, like, well, at that point we should be focusing more on cloning technology and not thinking that, we can do a Harry Potter, wave the magic wand and bring it back, sort of relying on that. So
my mind just goes to Jurassic Park. And like, didn't we all watch that movie? It didn't look like a really great idea in the show, so we should just let things be. And
little. I mean, the Hollywood part of that is they used the DNA and like 100% restored the dinosaur from extinction. And what all the scientists seem to be saying is that is impossible. I think it was years and years and years ago on Meat Eater, had a scientist on, a lady scientist that was, like a DNA scientist, and said it is not actually possible, because actually the second an animal dies, its genes, the DNA double helix starts to unravel and bust apart, and that can't be fixed.
Oh, interesting.
So it's this immediately upon death, the entire code, 2.5 billion bases, starts to break down. And the best you can do is you can get bits and chunks of it that haven't degraded, but they're only going to be bits and chunks for code for certain things, eye color, how hairy the ears are, how long the tail is. And that doesn't define everything that defines an entire species. So I remember from that show, she was basically, and they're talking about the mammoth,
Hmm.
saying it is biologically impossible to
Okay.
resurrect fully from extinction because you never will ever get the entire genome back of that species.
All right. So we
So
don't have to worry about T-Rexes coming back and
not right
velociraptors
now,
and stuff.
anyways.
Okay.
Who knows?
Phew.
Maybe AI will figure out how to do it or
Chat
preserve it or
GPT is
something.
gonna
Yeah,
figure it
yeah.
out.
So, anyways, that's what's going on around Canada, and we will see you all in the next episode.